Yeah, if you can mute yourself. I said that the presentation of Professor Passig is recorded.
Oh, it's recording already?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Okay. All right. So what I would like to start with is a very brief introduction to how we study trends, and then I'm going to elaborate a little bit about a few what we call mega trends of the 21st century. And in the third part, I would like to be a little bit more specific about your industry and your very specific corporation. So this field, a lot of people think that this field is a kind of magic, but actually it is a very known academic discipline that is already very well established. And nowadays it is being called future studies. And the reason is that there is infinite studies. There are infinite studies that we are trying to figure out how they are going to evolve and develop. And what we are trying to do is to organize those futures into categories and give those categories some reliability in order to really assess whether they are probable or just possible, and maybe wild cards, etc., etc. How do we do it? It's not an easy thing to explain in a very brief way, but the future studies is a branch of another scientific field, which is called systems thinking. And what we are trying to do is to understand the logic, how systems are evolving. Our main assumption is that there is logic how systems are evolving, and by systems we mean ecological systems and technological systems and geopolitical systems, any kind of a human and not just human kind of a system. And we're using a lot of methodologies with which we are trying really to figure out the logic how systems are developing. When we stumble upon a logic, we tend to put it on some models, statistical models or mathematical models with which we are trying to figure out the vector of that system. This is really, in a nutshell, the whole idea. And you are probably aware of some of the methodologies. We are also developing methodologies, and we are also taking methodologies from other fields. What really is unique about the field of future studies that it is very, very multidisciplinary. Okay, we tend to bring a lot of point of views into the systems in order really to understand how those systems are evolving. And this is something that is not easy to communicate in many people with many people, because during the last century, humanity has become very disciplinary kind of thinkers, and it's not an easy thing to break those barriers. But bit by bit, humanity is evolving to understand that everything is very, very complex. Take a look just of what's happening in this pandemic. If you don't take into account a lot of variables, then all your predictions are totally chaotic. The problem of all of us, because each one of us is a futurist by definition, what one of the main characteristic of the human mind that it is constantly thinking about the future. But the problem is that when we think about the future, we tend to do what we call a linear extrapolation. Which means that when you stand on a point in the present, what you tend to do is to look at the past and extrapolate what you believe you know about the past into the future. But this way of thinking is very, very problematic nowadays. It used to be somehow good in the 20th century. In the 21st century, it's already very even dangerous to continue thinking about it, because the reliability of this way of thinking is at best about 30%, which means at best, whatever you think is going to happen in the future with this way of thinking, at best, it's only 30% chance that it will happen at the end. And I don't have to explain that 30% is not enough nowadays. We need at least to double that reliability in order to come to 60 to 70%, which is by all means, it is defined as a real probable future. We are not at a stage in our evolution in which we can say that we can understand systems with 100% reliability. It will probably take us another century or two at least in order to reach, the 90%. But nowadays it's enough to say that whatever we say, it's 70% reliable, and we can manage and we can take our decisions with that kind of knowledge. This is the first time in human history that we have tools, scientific tools, with which we can really say something with that kind of reliability. So whatever I'm going to speak about today is about 70% reliability. We need to put it in mind always, because really with it is much, much complex nowadays to understand with higher reliability what's going to happen in the next decade or two. So what we are doing is actually trying to understand the logic of the systems and put that logic in different kinds of curves. And nowadays, the curves we have accumulated that describe a lot of phenomena are very bizarre. But what really is unique in our field is that each curve we have tend to have what we call the reliability or the predictive reliability of the curve. Each curve has a different figure that says how much we are sure that this curve really explains or depicts what's going to happen in the future. So we have, as I said, tons of curves. I don't have the time to go into elaborate, but I'm going to describe with you a few curves that are going to shape probably the whole 21st century. I'm going to give you a very large point of view from a bird's eye, and then I'm going to be very specific into your industry in the very near future, which is something like a decade or so. So as I said, it's not just we have tons of curves. There are a lot of academic journals nowadays that every month are publishing new curves. We tend to develop those curves. We tend to fine-tune our curves in different fields. And that's why this field is really a very, very well-established already nowadays. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take two very global megatrends that are going to shape the 21st century. I will introduce you to a term that I would very be glad if you will write it down and use it further in your meetings. The term is the driving force. A lot of people that are speaking about the future are speaking about the change that is going to happen. Okay, but in order to really understand the change that is in the making, we have to understand what we call the driving force of the change. If we are to define the driving force of change, then our predictions would be much more reliable. So this is a term I'm going to elaborate a little bit. I'm going to give you some examples of the driving forces of the 21st century, and then I'll zoom in back into your industry into a very near term of the future. I'm going to give you a very large perspective of humanity, okay? As far as we know, about 12,000 years ago, on this planet, we used to be something like about 1 to 5 million people. About 60,000 years ago, as far as we know from a scientific point of view, on this planet, there used to be about 10,000 Homo sapiens like you and me. And bit by bit, humanity just, developed and grew up to the point about 2,000 years ago, in which we have reached about 250 million people. But when we reached that figure, humanity started developing in a very unique curve, which is called nowadays the exponential curve. You have all heard about the exponential curve, which means it took humanity about 1800 years to quadruple itself from 250 million people to 1 billion people. But when we reached the 1 billion people about 200 years ago, we really started going amok, which means it took humanity about only 130 years to double it to 2 billion people. And then only 30 years, another billion people. And then only 15 years, another billion people. And now 12 years, another 5. And you see the idea of what we call nowadays the exponential curve. At this point in time, humanity have reached about 8 billion people. Okay, formally we are about 7.8 billion people, but we tend to add another 200 million or 300 million people that live among us, but they are not recorded in any way. Okay, in different places they are being called different ways. In the US, for example, they are called the undocumented people. In China, for example, they are called the floating population, etc., etc. So we are about 8 billion people, which is something unusual. Humanity has never took such an exponential curve in its development. And we tend to say that almost everything that happened in the last century, at least, is derived from those numbers. Most of us do not correlate it to these numbers, but everything almost that is happening from our ecosystems, from our global conflicts, from our every technologies, everything is driven by those numbers. And we have always to put it in mind. So how many people are going to be in the next 30 years worldwide? I believe you are all familiar with the numbers. We speak about something like almost 10 billion people, which is by all means a phenomena in human history, which means that in a matter of about 250 years only, humanity is going to go from 1 billion people, okay, to 10 billion people. And there was no such a phenomena in human history. And it has a lot of applications and implications. And this is what we are trying to study nowadays. How is it going to affect technologies? How is it going to affect societies? How is it going to economies? Everything is being derived from those numbers. What I would like to, before I'm going to explain what drives those figures, I would like to take you into the final, let's say, decade of the 21st century. Even though it's for many people it looks like it will never happen, because the numbers that we estimate are going to shape humanity to be reflected in humanity in the last decade of the 21st century are very important, because they are already affecting nowadays. So as far as we know from a lot of studies, there are three scenarios that might develop in terms of demographies in the last decade of the 21st century. I'm going to briefly describe those two scenarios. What we say is that at best, humanity is going to have another billion people in the second half of the 21st century, but there is a greater chance that humanity is going to slide back to the most devastating scenario is that we will slide back to 6 billion people. And the mid-range scenario speaks about 8 billion people at the end of the 21st century. Now, this is crucial because in any case, we are speaking about a phenomena in which humanity stops developing, stops growing, with a greater chance that it will even slide, even shrink at the end of the 21st century. Of course, there will be different kinds of nations and countries that will have some varieties, but generally speaking, this is what we call the demographic winter of the 21st century. And I'm stressing it because for the last 50, 60 years, all our experts are telling us that that the most devastating trend of the 21st century is what today called the demographic explosion of people, and that's not exactly what we see at the moment in front of us, and it's going to have probably some very positive impact and some very negative impact, and we are trying to understand how it's going to play in different fields. Now, put in mind that a lot of people now are trying to understand the outcome of this mega trend. I'm aware of tons of books that are trying to address different aspects of human civilization that is going to be affected by these trends. I'm going to briefly explain or describe, first of all, where is it coming from, because where is it coming from is the most important thing to understand, because when you understand it, then you can elaborate and try to see how is it relevant to your very specific endeavor. So as far as we know, one of the driving forces of the demographic winter is that for the first time in human history, as far as we know, there are more males than females worldwide. Okay, this is the average worldwide, which means that at this age, up of 19 years old, there are 17% more males than females. It used to be exactly the opposite for millennia. Okay, and we are also trying to understand where is it coming from, what drives that phenomena. It's not exactly clear at the moment. We have a list of reasons that are probably driving this phenomena, but they are not really explaining the whole scope of this phenomena, because this is really huge. One of them is probably what we call the abortions, or what we found is that for millennia there were more miscarriages of boys than girls. Nobody really understands how come there were so much miscarriages of males. Nowadays, because of technology and medicine, etc., we have somehow were able to overcome what we call miscarriages. But what happened is we have misbalanced the ratio of genders. We will probably take care of it in the 21st century, 22nd century, but this trend is going to shape a lot of things in the 21st century. There are a lot of consequences. Just think about what does it mean that 17% of males during the 21st century are not going to have biological horizon. They will have a lot. They will have a lot of difficulties to have female mates, etc., etc. So it's going to drive from criminal activities to world conflicts in different places, to different kinds of technologies that are going to be developed to address that larger group in human society, and a lot of things that are being now researched worldwide. Take a look of what's happening now in the European community at large. Okay, put in mind that age group, that cohort up to 19 years old, are the people that are going to live during the 21st century. Okay, so there are already at this point in time 6% more males than females in Europe. More specifically, in Sweden, you can see there are already 7% more males than females. So all those trends are going to have a great impact. Take, for example, in China, 11% more males than females. In the Arab world, for example, in Saudi Arabia, they have already 20% more males than females. And it has already a lot of impact on for example, take for example how ISIS are behaving in the last decade, and part of it is because they don't have enough females to mate with, and we see a lot of very bizarre phenomena in that place in the world. I'm going to take some of the ideas from this book. I understood that you have received this book, and I hope you'll have the time to go over it and see how it's going to act on world conflicts in the next 30 years, because world conflicts are one of the driving forces of technologies, of economies, etc., etc. This book has been translated into a few languages. One of them is in English, so I believe you have the English version. Let me take you to another, what we call a driving force. And here in this chart, I'm summarizing a lot of literature in two lines. And what you see here is the ratio between ages in humanity, not between genders. Okay, as far as we know, for millennia, amazingly, an amazing phenomena. For millennia, there were, on average, about 15% of humanity. They used to be young people, 5 years and younger. Okay, and for millennia, there were about 3% of humanity elders of 65 years and older. Millennia, that was the ratio between ages. What we see in the last 60, 70 years is an amazing trend that you can see here. We are about to reach a point of no return, what we call it, in which there are the same amount of people, or elders people, as very young children. And by 2050, a phenomena of thousands of years is going to be reversed totally. Okay, what does it mean? That we will have more elders than children. How is it going to affect new maladies, for example? How is it going to affect nutrition? How is it going to affect economies? A lot of people are trying to understand the outcome of this trend. If I'm not mistaken, nowadays in Europe, generally speaking, there are already 15% people 65 years and older overall the population. but it's growing constantly. I can tell you that when, for example, when the idea of um, uh, going into the last let's say the golden age of people was developed by Bismarck, there were only 3% people that reached that age. And nowadays we are speaking that already in Europe about 15%. I'm not aware how many people, how many elders will be in Europe in 30 years from now. I know that in Israel, one of the scenarios speaks about 28% of society will reach 60 years and older. And at the beginning, they used to, stick around another 2-3 years after 65 years old. Nowadays, people are still living 20 and 25 years after 65 years. And that's going to shape almost everything. By the way, what you see here is the driving force of a lot of technologies, is the driving force of your industry. Because as far as we know, by 2050, there won't be enough young people that will take over societies, or human power, if you wish, or manpower. So at this very stage already, we are in our subconsciousness looking for technologies that will somehow balance those numbers. And one of them is, for, of course, what we call robotics. The other one is something that is much, much more important. We know that if you don't have enough kids nowadays, we know that in 35 years from now, you don't have enough people that will be the problem solvers of the problems that will occur 35 years from now. So at this very point already in our subconsciousness, we know that we need technologies that will help us solve problems. One of them is what we call nowadays artificial intelligence. And this is what we call the driving forces of trends that will mature and occur only 20-30 years ahead in time. Okay, if you wish to see it in colors, this is the elderly dependency ratio, which means how many people will be dependent on working people. Nowadays in 2020, you see how the world is somehow being reflected here. By 2060, you see that there are much more elders than people that are supporting them. And by the end of the 21st century, you see a very different human civilization that never happened, as far as we know in history. Sometimes here and there were some trends that developed in different regions like this one, but speaking about a whole human civilization that will have a very large portion of elderly people. Of course, we will define elderly in a different way, but nonetheless, when you are 70-year-old or 80-year-old, your thinking is very different, your physiology is very different, your values are very different, etc., etc. And it's going to have a great impact on societies. I don't believe that at this point we really understand the full scope of the impact of this phenomena. If you wish to see it in numbers, here are the numbers. Some people have much easier time to understand things in numbers. Take a look. By 2050, there will be only 500 million people worldwide at the age of 4 to 5 years old, and about 1.5 or 2 billion people that will be 60 years and older. Of course, it will be divided differently in different places, and I'm going to touch upon it a little bit. But this trend can reflect a lot of developments a lot of industries, a lot of services, different services that will have to be developed in order to address those kinds of demographies. Take a look of what's happening in Europe. Okay, the decline is clear. There are very few nations and countries in Europe that are going somehow to add some to their populations. But most of European communities and nations are going to lose populations by during the 21st century. Take a look at this one, which is really huge, and nobody is really taking a look at it. Nobody is paying attention to it. Take a look at China. China is going to lose half of its population during the 21st century. This is huge. It's going to have a great effect on almost any industry in the world. And not just industry, of course, the balance of powers. Everybody is speaking about, the emerging new superpower. I'm not part of those people that believe that this is what's going to happen. Take a look at India. Also, they are going to lose a quarter of their population. Okay, the only one of the nations that are going really to grow is Nigeria, but that's not something that is part of our concern at the moment. The US also is going to add a little bit more people, okay, to maybe 350 million people. Some say at the best 380 million people. Now they have 325 million people. Japan is also shrinking. They are shrinking by half, which is mind-boggling. We know, of course, the reasons, but we have to put it in mind if we are to look for new markets, if we are to look for the new kinds of services and products that will be relevant to that kind of populate. Okay. The other driving force is what we call the global fertility rates. Okay, I'm trying, if you are still with me, I'm trying to explain that phenomena that is already having a term nowadays, which is the demographic winter of the 21st century. So these are the reasons that are driving that, are pushing the global demographic winter. Now, in order for a society to develop, to continue and grow, a female needs to have in her life cycle about 2.1 kids. Above that, everything is growing, is developing. Less than that, everything is shrinking. Take a look what happened during the last 70 years and our projections into the future. By the way, this is a very large project of the UN, in which they are constantly understanding how societies are going to develop and shrink in the 21st century. All their predictions go to at the end of the 21st century. So take a look. In the 50s, there were about, in most of the European countries, there were about 2 or 3 kids at best. By 2020, almost everybody has gone under the replacement rate. The 2.1 kids is the replacement rate, okay? And there are some people, some nations that are awakening from this trend, and they are pushing back to have more kids, but most of the countries, not just most, all the countries in Europe are barely reaching the replacement rate by 2050. Even by the end of the 21st century, all of the European countries are not replacing their population. And I believe that you are aware of this trend. It is happening in a very devastating way, not in Europe, but in the Arab world, for example. In the Arab world, it is really critical because it's going to change those cultures in the Arab world. Take, for example, in the 50s, they used to have 6, 7 kids. Nowadays, they have on average about 2.5 kids for each female. By 2050, they are scratching the replacement rate, and by the end of the 21st century, most of them they are going down below the replacement rate, and it's going really to have a devastating impact on the Arab world and the Muslim world, more specifically, by the way, the Sunni world, because in the Shiite world, it's exactly the opposite. They have more females than males. In the Sunni world, they have more males than females. And this is something that is also driving the regional conflicts, and it has also some impact. Let me take you to one aspect of the demographic winter, which is very important for your industry, okay, which was what we call the population density. Take a look of what's happening in Europe. The population density at this point is about, on average, is about 200 people on each square kilometers. There are some nations or some countries that are much more than that, but most of the European countries are much less than the average. It's not just less, it's really much less, and that gives you a sense of the industries that are going to develop because of the shrinkage of the populate by the end of the 21st century. Take a look how by 2050 the population density is going to be in Europe. You see this light blue is nowadays, and the dark blue is 2050, which means that most of the nations their population is going down, and the population density is opening a lot of space for different people to take over that land, and that land might be taken by let's say agricultures, different kinds of agri-techs, etc., because in other places in the world that land is becoming much more important. Or however, in Europe, the land is becoming less and less important in the formula that describes or define markets in the future. By the way, if you take into exam China, or generally speaking Asia nowadays, they have 1,000 people on each square kilometer. In Israel, we have now 400 people on each square kilometer, and we are one of the only nations that are going to double their population by 2050. We are not just going to double, we are going even to triple our population by the end of the 21st century. So Israel is going to be the only nation, the only country that is going to triple its populate by the end of 21st century. It has a lot, of course, of impact, more specifically into markets that are going to be opened, of course, to an industry like yours. By the way, the most dense country now in the world is Macau, with 21,000 people on each square kilometer. Now, I'm stressing it because I understand that you are looking for new markets worldwide. So if you see, Israel is going to really triple its populate. The most dense city worldwide is Manhattan, which not a lot of people really are realizing it. Okay, there are about 27,000 people on each square kilometer because it's a very dense place. Only 20 square kilometers in Manhattan. There are habitants. There are 1.6 million people, but in normal days, there are every day 4 more million commuters. That makes about 94,000 people on each square kilometer that are moving in that city. Now, I'm speaking about a city. I'm not speaking about the metropolis of New York. The most dense metropolis worldwide now is Tokyo. Okay, specifically Tokyo itself, the city itself is 6,500 people. However, if you take into account not just the inhabitants of the city itself, but the metropolitan area is 38 million people, which means now in the metropolitan area of Tokyo, there are 300,000 people on each square kilometer, which is very, very, very dense. We are all aware of it, but we don't see it most of the time by numbers. So if you're looking at new markets, this is one way to look at where to put your chips in order to make it as much as possible profitable. So I would like to take you now to a very small presentation about how nutrition is going to develop in the 21st century. What's the paradigm of nutrition is going to develop in the 21st century? And you will be able to, later on, we will be able to discuss the impact of such a phenomena. Now, you are all aware of the typical S-curve. I believe you know how many industries are working with this S-curve. Gartner is using the S-curve to predict a lot of technologies, but not everybody is aware that there is not an S-curve, but a hyper S-curve. Now, generally speaking, the S-curve is progressing in 5 stages, okay, or 6 stages if you wish. Okay, there is the first stage of the S-curve is what we call the stage of basic research. Very few people are aware of that trend. A lot of people are investing a lot of funds, but very few of those funds will be realized and will give some revenue at the end. And then suddenly, after about a decade of basic research, that's the average, there is a hype phase in which everybody is speaking that this is going to change the world, that technology is going to be so profitable, everybody is running to invest. What we have found is that after a very short period of a hype phase, about 2 or 3 years, there is a very long period of disappointment from that technology or that market or that service. Okay, in this phase that might take even a decade, this is where real innovation is being done. The real innovation in terms of looking for real applications that can be profitable in the future. And then about a decade of disappointment, suddenly there is a breakthrough of that technology, and the curve takes an exponential form. In a matter of a very few years, there are a lot of applications that many people are doing a lot of benefits from their investments if they did their investment at this stage. Because if people do their investment at this stage, then they will just take a very short period of hype, and then they will be losing a lot of their investments. And as anything in nature, there is a fading phase in which the S-curve constantly goes down. What many people are not aware of is that when the curve reaches the point of many application, there is a kind of evolution of that same product or that same service, etc., or market, etc., etc., in which everything starts from again with a new paradigm, okay, or a new understanding of a service. This is what we call the hyper S. Generally speaking, these are the spots in which people that are really willing to do innovation can do the innovation in order to take in a matter of a few years to be part of the exponential curve that will emerge for the second curve or the third curve, etc., etc. So a lot of technologies, a lot of markets are developing in such a way. I would like to share with you an idea how humanity is going to evolve in another phase, another curve in terms of how we understand what nutrition is. As far as we know, in the last century, something like that, humanity has gone through four curves of what is it exactly nutrition, what is it exactly food for human beings. Okay, for millennia we used to think that food is only to sustain our body and to continue living. However, in the last century, humanity went through another curve, which is the first curve is understanding that food or nutrition is not just to sustain our body, but to have a healthy body, a healthy physical activities. Okay, and then we went to another curve, which we went through it in during the 60s and the 70s, in which we understood that people don't have time to have their food be ready for them. So there was a curve which is called now the instant curve food. Okay, and then we went through the anti-allergic food, and then we are now into the stage in which everything needs to be tasty, everything needs to be really nice and flavor with plenty of flavors, etc., etc. What I would like to share with you in the time I have is what is the next curve that is probably going to emerge if we take into account that there is logic how these curves are evolving. Okay, remember the beginning of my presentation, everything we say about the future needs to be based on some logic that we stumble upon. That logic, of course, needs to be tested and reliable, and still it's not, of course, 100% reliable, but we're speaking about a trend that we might say that it is about 70% reliable in the next decade, or at best a couple decades. And this is what people think in the literature is going to be the next curve. But I would like just to give you some examples of the previous curves. And remember that each curve went those 5-6 stages. All right. So we are speaking here, this is the healthy curve that has been developed. And remember that it doesn't say that when a curve ends, then it ends totally. The long tail of its decline might be really very, 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 very long. It's like the long tail of its beginning might be also very, very long. Okay, but the majority, or the hype, if you wish, or the most known or addressed by industries is what we speak about the curve. So this is just one example of a product that reflects the paradigm of a healthy food. Here you see just one that I have found of the paradigm of instant food. Okay, what you see here is the paradigm of the anti-allergic food. And a lot of industries, a lot of companies are doing a lot of business around those paradigms. But remember, I'm not sure they understand at what stage their paradigm is in the S-curve. What I'm trying to stress here is that if you are aware of those paradigms and you are able to pinpoint exactly at what phase that paradigm is in its life cycle, you have a very important tool with which you can take decisions about your next products or in your next markets. Okay, this is the anti-allergic food, and here we speak about the tasty food, and it's all over the world. You can see it even in emerging markets and of course third world countries. So if these were the four paradigms, we can deduct and I don't have time to elaborate exactly how we deduct it, but we can deduct that there is a logic behind the emergence of a new paradigm that is going to be very dominant in food industries. And this is what we call the fountain of youth. We have reached a point in which humanity is saying, well, that's not enough for me, healthy food. I would like food that will give me some advantage, a physical advantage, and push forward the elasticity of our physical entity. I would like nutrition that will give me some more healthy years, not just give me healthy years as it is now. I would like some more healthy years. And that's also, it's been reflected in the way World Health Organization now is calculating the life expectancy. We do not calculate anymore life expectancy just by how many years we live. We calculate now how many healthy years an average human being is living nowadays. Okay, just by the way, the average life expectancy now worldwide is about 75 years on average, and the average of healthy years is about 65 years on average. And of course, there are differences between nations. The most advanced, let's say, healthier nation is Japan. They have already 78 years of healthy years. By the way, we tend to add 5 to 10 years of elderly maladies beyond those healthy years. So humanity has reached a point in which they are ready to feed itself, not just to sustain itself, not just to have, some culinary kind of experiences, but we want to extend our healthy years beyond the average nowadays. And one way to do it, science is already looking for ways to do it. One way to do it is by emulating calories restriction. I don't know if you are all familiar with the term of calories restriction, but what we have found is that if we intake only 70% of the calories we need daily, then we can add about 30% life expectancy. Again, if you take only 70% calories that are being calculated nowadays, that they are the average of a human being. By the way, for a male, it's about 1,500 calories a day. For a female, is less than that, about 1,000 calories a day, if I'm not mistaken. So the idea of calories restriction is that if you take only 70% of it daily, it doesn't matter if it's fat or not, okay? It doesn't matter if your nutrition is healthy or not. Then you can add between 10% to 30% life expectancy. So science now is trying to emulate calories restriction without having to take only 70%, because 70% is really feeling constantly very not so healthy, because you are being driven constantly by a different kind of need. So how do you emulate calories restriction without going to malnutrition? Because a lot of people that will do 70% calories intake might very easily go to malnutrition. And science now is trying to develop technologies with which we will be able to eat healthy, our daily calories, but our body will react as if it was 70% less. And there are a lot of studies now being done worldwide, how you do it exactly. They are trying to extract genes that have been found in different animals, in order to understand how those animals are constantly eating, but they are not gaining fat, they are not gaining weight, etc., etc., and they are trying to have those genes being developed in laboratories, in order to put them in our future nutrition, so that our kids, let's say a decade from now, will be able to eat a lot, but their body will react as those animals that are constantly eating and are not gaining weight. And if this is something that will add to our life expectancy, it will be huge in terms of technology that might emerge as the fifth curve of the nutrition that we have went through during at least the last century. So I will rest my case here. I'm speaking exactly 45 minutes as you have asked, and we'll open it to discussion as much as I can, as much as I understand. I'll try to react to whatever you have in mind. So let me stop sharing, and we will open it to discussion. Whoever would like to lead the discussion, I'll be very glad to, and we'll see how it develops. All right. Well, people are writing here in a language I'm not exactly familiar with.
No, we were joking about that moving to South Africa seems to be a very good option. But then you were presenting fertility rates, so we replied that we knew what to do there then.
All right, I see everybody is a male here, so those are the male jokes.
Yeah. There's one female, but she switched off her camera.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question? Do you want this live or in the chat, Guus? How do you want this?
No, live.
Live. Good. Thank you first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. Very insightful. I wrote down a couple of keywords, which is growing population, but maybe not growing as rapidly as the last 200 years for sure. Healthier food, lower calories. I got you. I think that's, yeah, I mean, that's where we're going, right? But I'm not, can you give a little bit more insight on for example, which direction animal protein is going? Is there a future for animal protein, or are the future consumers far more interested in plant-based nutrition? And also, I keep hearing about DNA specific food, so that we're all going to have a DNA passport to which certain foods belong or not. Can you go a little bit more into depth on that? Because otherwise I'm only stuck with healthy and less calories. Which
let me divide it into two periods of times. Okay, in the next 30 years, humanity is growing by any means. Okay, it's growing. We're going from 8 billion people to 10 billion people. There is no way to feed people without animal proteins. There is no way to have to feed 10 billion people, and everybody in the world now is looking for food. We are not at an age in which there is malnutrition and phenomena like humanity used to experience for millennia. According to the UN, there are only 120 million people out of 8 billion people now that are somehow in a different way, a different kind of malnutrition worldwide. So how do you feed 10 billion people? And the only way to feed them with is with animals. So there will be about 3%, 5%, 10% people that will not feed themselves with animals. They will feed themselves with some other plants, artificial kind of proteins. All right, but it's going to be very, very expensive. But if you speak about humanity, we are still in the next 30 years in a phase in which animal-based protein is the most important ingredient. Now, for the second half of the 21st century, that might change. Okay, I'm only might because I'm not sure, because still there is a scenario that speaks that we're going to add another billion people. Okay, if this scenario will be realized at the end, then how do you feed 11 billion people that everybody is looking for healthy nutrition? There will be always 100 million people that are going to be going through devastating times, devastating wars that will be going through malnutrition, if you wish. But the majority of humanity we need to feed 10 billion people on average in the 21st century.
And you say we do this with animals?
This is the only way. There's no other way. There are other alternatives, but they are so expensive, and of course you don't have enough land to cultivate so many plants that are from which you can extract protein.
Yeah, and do you believe, this is not a leading question, do you believe that we can do that in a sustainable manner? Because is that something that you see in your futuristic view that at some stage?
Okay, now you're going to a political issue. Okay, the political issue is that there will be some nations that will not, I'm trying to be very politically correct here. Okay, some nations will have a lot of populate that will push them politically to be more sustainable. However, other nations, they won't have any other option, which means we might see a divide between nations. Some nations will strive to be more sustainable, okay, and they will pay very expensively for it, because those options are very expensive. Other nations will say, we are not going to go through that path, and we cannot afford very expensive food to our populate. So humanity might see some conflicts, but at the bottom line, at the end, humanity during the 21st century cannot survive without protein from animals.
And how do you see then, a final question, how we have, you mentioned, you had a couple of examples from Nestle. We also have a Danone speaker in a few weeks' time, and they are spending the majority of their innovation budget at the moment on non-dairy protein. How do you see that then? How do you see that evolving then? Are they in the wrong direction, or are they just trying to feed the Western world? How do you see that? If you were an advisor to them, what would you be saying? Because that's completely contradictory to what they are working on, which I hope you're right. I very much I hope you're right. So that's my last question. How do you see that? Have they got it wrong, or are you looking further ahead?
No, it depends. How do they define their future markets? Now, if they define their future market to exclusive, let's say, markets and nations, they might have, a segment of the global market. That segment might be very, profitable. I'm not saying it won't be profitable, but it will be very small compared to the world market. Okay, if you are to go to the global market, then I'm not the one to say that that they are wrong. But if they will decide to go to the global market, they will be devastated.
Okay, thanks for your insights.
Anybody else, guys? Go ahead, Serge.
Unmute, Serge.
I'm better. I was wondering about the population, the world population aging. In this group, when you look carefully, there's one really young guy in the middle, and he is leading the innovations group of Lely.
Oh.
And that's perhaps for a reason, that the innovation is coming from young people who are striving to do things differently, and the elderly, they like to settle, keep things as they are. And now you mentioned that to keep working on solutions, we need AI. That those are the new problem solvers, AI solutions. But how a solution also needs to be absorbed by society. People need to embrace a new solution. And how does the fact that elderly population, will they still be open for innovations?
Okay, let's define elderly. Nowadays, we define elders as 65 years and older, okay? Probably by 2050, we'll define elders as 80 years and older.
But that then make it older. It's already from 45 people are...
Hang on,
well,
hang on.
I'm not sure. Let's not exaggerate, okay? What I'm trying to say is that if, and by the way, this is a very interesting debate that is going on now in Silicon Valley. There is, a wave of discontent on Silicon Valley, because they are saying that they are developing technologies that are not solving real problems of larger groups that are growing worldwide. They are solving problems for teenagers and for the 20 years old group cohort. So it might happen that we'll see in nutrition, for example, a wave that will reflect much better the needs of elders. And this is what I'm trying to say. I'm not sure that I understand at this point what type of nutrition a person of 80 years old is going to eat, is going to have 10, 20 years from now. I know, generally speaking, that the more you age, you eat less protein from animals, and you eat more dairy because it's easier to ingest. Now, that might open a very interesting market if you will be able to go to that group of people and tell them, I'm not going just to give you some tasty yogurt. I'm going to give you a yogurt that is not just healthy, but that might enhance your healthy years or enlarge them, might give you, that might be amazing. So I'm not sure that I understand exactly what they might like, but I know that they might need. Okay, so if you will be able, whoever will be in the next few years in the market, will be able to communicate that paradigm, then I believe, since it's a very needed, let's say, people, the baby boomers, they would like to stick around more and more years. Okay, and if you give them something that that support that notion, they might change very easily than we think. Now, they might not accept nutrition paradigms of nowadays, because they are not exactly let's say willing to only eat, because they don't need a lot of nutrition at that age. Not like a 10, 20 and 30-year-old that are eating everything they see. But if you give them something that is very relevant to their fears, to their needs, they might change to a very different paradigm very easily than we think now. Am I clear?
Yeah, I understand what you mean.
All right.
Yeah. We had that, it's about 12 o'clock. I would say there's time for a final question, also to respect agendas.
I would like to ask one question, David. I think you described nicely the 5 trends in food that we have seen over the past. Of course, we're very interested in the future. And assume we buy into your idea that the demand for animal protein continues to grow. I think probably until 2050, that could be correct. But you didn't speak about the how to produce that. And where I do think you might be right on that growth, that doesn't mean we will produce it in the same way as we do today, right? And that, I think, is for Lely very relevant. And you try to get away from the question by being politically correct. But maybe new societies do want to eat animal protein, but not the way we produce it today.
Exactly. That's what I was trying to stress to Andre. Okay, I'm saying that there will be some countries that politically they will drive that trend to eat protein not from animals. Okay, but the majority of humanity is not at that stage. They cannot afford it, even if they would like to.
Mm-hmm. No, but I'm more aiming on the how the animal protein is produced. So assume they will consume animal protein in Asia, in Latin, in Africa, wherever the big people numbers are. But probably that next generation is not going to accept anymore the way we produce it today.
Yeah, that's what,
for me, two different things, right?
the only other way to produce protein, animal protein, not from animals, is in an artificial way, which is being done now in a lot of places worldwide. Okay, but it's so expensive. It needs to be so cheap and also tasty. Okay, and nonetheless, you need the ingredients that are coming from different animals. We're not speaking about ingredients that are coming from plants. So in any case, you need animals. In any case, politically, a lot of people will say, even though it has been grown not exactly in a farm, but in a lab, but it's from an animal, I will not eat it. So even though we will have other ways to grow animal proteins, if it's a tendency not to eat from animals, it will be also there, and because of that, it will be very expensive. But the majority of humanity, during at least the next 30 years, there's no other option. We are speaking about 10 billion people. This is not, Europe is what, 300 million people now.
Yes.
That's it. Okay, even if all Europe will go through to one path of growing protein animals, it's nothing. Okay, this is not the huge market. So humanity in the 21st century, some people will say, are in any case in a difficult time because of course of the outcome of growing animals worldwide.
Yeah, and in this respect, we have to judge if this is a cultural, so a national geographical thing, or is it an age thing? If I look to my kids, they are born in a house where we ate a lot of meat, but today I have to fight to keep that meat on the table. And they are around 20 years of age, they study, they are in the environment that will set the scene for the future. It is so different. And then I wonder, is it a geographical thing because they're born in a wealthy Western environment, or is it an age thing? No, because when it's an age thing, it will appear also in Asia and other nations.
I believe it's a cultural, economic state of the person. The more you are healthy, the less you eat meat. That's the correlation.
That's interesting.
The more you are wealthy, okay?
Wealthy, not healthy.
Okay. Not healthy.
Wealthy,
they say healthy now. Wealthy. The more you're wealthy, the less you eat meat. So it's only there because of a cultural and economic state of mind. Okay, the more when people go through malnutrition, the most important thing to give them is meat. Most of our ingredients are coming, our physical needs are coming from meat, most of them.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. It is already 12:06. So I would like to close this session. If there are any questions which are still tumbling around in your head after this presentation, feel free to share them with either Aart or me, and we will make sure they will be sent to Professor Passig, who hopefully will answer them in a right manner then. So far, thank you all for attending. And
thank you so much, guys. Thank you so
Professor
much.
Passig, for the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Hey, send me the recording.
Yes, I will.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.